Monsieur le Président du Conseil d'État, Monsieur le Consul général, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, Monsieur le Professeur, Mesdames et Messieurs en vos titres et fonctions, chers collègues, chers invités, chers amis, il y a près de 270 ans, Rousseau adressait à la République de Genève son discours sur l'origine et les fondements de l'inégalité parmi les hommes. Il n'était plus citoyen. Il aspirait à le redevenir. Il consultait, ce sont ces termes, le zèle qui l'animait et son amour de la vérité pour signer « Votre concitoyen ». C'est notre concitoyen de Genève qui a transformé la philosophie politique moderne en s'attaquant aux inégalités. S'attaquer aux inégalités, c'est mal dit. Rousseau a fait de l'inégalité, je le cite, une des questions les plus intéressantes que la philosophie puisse proposer et malheureusement une des plus épineuses que les philosophes puissent résoudre. C'est que pour Rousseau, l'inégalité n'est pas un problème politique parmi d'autres. C'est le problème politique essentiel, c'est-à-dire le problème que la politique est appelée à résoudre, faute de perdre son contenu. Si les humains ont transformé leur première communauté en société politique, c'était, selon Rousseau, pour établir des systèmes de législation qui leur permettraient à toutes et à tous d'être également libres. L'inégalité entrave la liberté, ce dont souffrent constamment ceux qui sont victimes des inégalités. Dans un État inégalitaire, on est moins libre. Vous le savez toutes et tous, l'inégalité est un sentiment courant. Elle provoque l'indignation, la tristesse, parfois la honte, souvent la colère. Et lorsque la politique ne parvient pas à résoudre, ou du moins à diminuer l'inégalité, ou qu'elle la résout mal, les citoyennes et les citoyens perdent espoir et perdent confiance en la politique et se tournent alors souvent vers des formes extrêmes de participation. Cette nécessité de réfléchir à l'inégalité dans une perspective qui prenne en compte la bonne vie dans des institutions justes a dicté la rédaction du contrat social. Dans cet ouvrage, Rousseau écrit avec force, ça peut être un t-shirt, « Si l'on cherche en quoi consiste le plus grand bien de tous, qui doit être la fin de tout système de législation, on trouvera qu'il se réduit à deux objets principaux, la liberté et l'égalité. La liberté parce que toute dépendance particulière est autant de force ôtée au corps de l'État. L'égalité parce que la liberté ne peut subsister sans elle. Il n'y a pas de liberté sans égalité. » J'ai déjà dit ce qu'est la liberté civile, et à l'égard de l'égalité, il ne faut pas entendre par ce mot que les degrés de puissance et de richesse soient absolument les mêmes, mais que, quant à la puissance, elle soit au-dessous de toute violence et ne s'exerce jamais qu'en vertu du rang et des lois. Et quant à la richesse, que nul citoyen ne soit assez opulent pour en pouvoir acheter un autre, et nul assez pauvre pour être contraint de se vendre. Ce qui suppose, du côté des grands, modération des biens et de crédit, et du côté des petits, modération d'avarice et de convoitise. Cette égalité, disent-ils, est une chimère de spéculation qui ne peut exister que dans la pratique, mais si l'abus est inévitable, s'ensuit-il qu'il ne faille pas au moins le régler. C'est parce que la force des choses tend toujours à détruire l'égalité que la force de la législation doit toujours tendre à la maintenir. C'est à réfléchir à cet abus et aux manières concrètes de les régler, mais aussi aux manières théoriques de penser l'inégalité, que s'est attelé Michael Sandel dans une œuvre importante, traversée par l'urgence. L'œuvre de Sandel, professeur à Harvard, est aujourd'hui traduite dans plus de 30 langues, et elle vient d'être saluée, vous le savez sans doute, par le prix Berggruen, qui est pour ainsi dire le Nobel des philosophes. Sandel, comme Rousseau, ne croit pas que l'égalité soit une chimère de spéculation. Mais il est convaincu depuis son premier ouvrage que pour indiquer la source de l'inégalité, il ne faut ni la réduire à une question juridique, ni à une question économique, mais qu'elle est indissolublement morale et politique. Sandel aurait pu écrire avec le Rousseau de l'Émile que ceux qui voudront traiter séparément la politique et la morale n'entendront jamais rien à aucune des deux. Il se trouve que Michael Sandel a reconnu à Rousseau, dans son récent dialogue avec Thomas Piketty, la paternité d'une thèse. Je le cite, « L'invention économique de l'inégalité n'a été possible, selon Rousseau, qu'en raison d'une modification des attitudes liées à la manière dont nous nous reconnaissons et dont nous nous considérons les uns les autres. L'inégalité économique est une question morale et politique avant d'être une question économique. Contre toute définition procédurale de la justice, qui placerait le juste plus haut que le bien, Sandel défend la priorité du bien. Il le fait dans le libéralisme et les limites de la justice, il le fait dans ce que l'argent ne peut acheter, les limites morales du marché, il le fait dans contre la perfection, les enjeux éthiques de la génétique, et il le fait aussi, comment n'y serions-nous pas sensibles ici, devant tant d'étudiantes et d'étudiants, quand il s'interroge sur ce que peut être un système de formation juste. Il le fait donc sur ce point dans la tyrannie du mérite, qu'avons-nous fait du bien commun? Il le fait encore dans son cours mondialement connu, Justice. Quand la politique perd de vue la recherche d'institutions justes qui permet la recherche d'un bien commun, elle se condamne à provoquer, parfois à son corps défendant, des systèmes inégalitaires. Ou, dans les termes de Sandel lui-même, si pour avoir une société juste, il faut que nous nous demandions ce qu'est la vie bonne, il reste à déterminer quel genre de discours politique nous orienterait dans la bonne direction. Le défi, poursuit-il, est d'imaginer une politique qui prenne au sérieux les questions morales et spirituelles, et pas seulement lorsqu'il s'agit de sexe ou d'avortement, mais également de sujets économiques et civiques plus larges. À quoi pourrait ressembler une politique nouvelle du bien commun? Sandel suggère plusieurs thèmes. Celui de la citoyenneté et du sacrifice, celui, et c'est un thème sur lequel il revient beaucoup, de la démarchandisation de certains biens, dont l'école et l'université, celui de la solidarité et de la vertu civique contre l'inégalité, celui enfin d'une politique de l'engagement moral. Je cite la clausule de justice, « Une politique de l'engagement moral n'est pas simplement un idéal plus exaltant qu'une politique de l'évitement, c'est aussi un fondement plus prometteur pour une société juste. » Qui oserait dire, dans cette salle et à l'extérieur de cette salle, que les questions de Sandel ne sont pas nos questions? Ces questions étaient celles de Rousseau, et c'est pourquoi la Société Jean-Jacques Rousseau, en partenariat avec l'État de Genève, la MRL et l'Université de Genève, a décidé de consacrer une année d'action aux inégalités. Nous irons dans les écoles, dans les cycles, dans les collèges, pour discuter avec les élèves de leur perception des inégalités. Nous travaillerons aux côtés de quelques-unes des institutions qui aident les migrants, les déshérités et les victimes de toutes les inégalités. Nous recueillerons des témoignages et nous organiserons des tables rondes. Nous nous tournerons certes vers des expertes et des experts de certaines formes d'inégalité, mais jamais, jamais, nous ne prétendrons faire la leçon à celles et ceux qui en souffrent. Souvent, l'inégalité est celle de la parole et du savoir. Alors, il nous faut écouter et ne pas faire semblant de savoir. Car telle est la mission des critiques, des philosophes, des universitaires, non pas parler au nom d'eux, non pas parler pour, mais parler avec. Parler avec, c'est mieux que faire parler. Ce m'est un plaisir ici de remercier celles et ceux qui ont rendu ce programme possible et la venue de Michael Sandel en ces lieux, Angelos Alexopoulos de Tobima, Madame Coranda Pierrimbert, conseillère culturelle à l'État de Genève, Mesdames Anne Laufer et Constance Moller de l'Université de Genève, Mathieu César et Marie Oulmar du département d'Histoire de la Faculté des Lettres, Messieurs Fabrice Brandly et Florian Stresemann de la Société Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Je suis heureux d'inviter à prendre la parole Didier Rabou, secrétaire général de l'Université de Genève, qui a soutenu ce projet avec l'efficacité et la générosité que nous lui connaissons.
Monsieur le Président du Conseil d'État, Monsieur le Consul, chers et chers collègues, chers amis, Mesdames et Messieurs, alors C'est un honneur pour l'Université de Genève que d'ouvrir cette soirée consacrée à une interrogation qui demeure au cœur de nos sociétés. Pourquoi l'inégalité compte-t-elle aujourd'hui ? Dans cette ville, Genève, qui porte encore l'empreinte intellectuelle de Rousseau, nous accueillons un penseur qui, comme lui, ose mettre à l'épreuve nos certitudes, interroger nos institutions et rappeler que la dignité humaine n'est jamais un acquis, mais toujours une exigence. Genève connaît, elle aussi, ce paradoxe contemporain, être à la fois un espace de prospérité et un territoire où les fractures sociales persistent. Notre canton se distingue par une économie dynamique, une diversité culturelle remarquable, une tradition d'accueil et d'engagement international, et pourtant, derrière cette vitalité, subsistent des réalités que nous ne pouvons ignorer. Le coût du logement, qui met à l'épreuve de nombreuses familles, les inégalités d'accès à la santé ou à la formation, la précarité qui touche une partie de la population active, y compris des jeunes en formation ou des travailleurs essentiels. Ces réalités sociales rappellent que l'inégalité n'est pas un concept abstrait. Elle façonne des trajectoires de vie. Elle influence la participation démocratique. Elle fragilise la confiance civique. Et c'est précisément ce lien entre justice, liberté, égalité que le professeur Sandel explore avec rigueur et humanité. Ces travaux mondialement reconnus nous invitent à penser ce que nous devons les uns aux autres, au-delà des logiques de mérite ou de performance, et à redécouvrir le sens du bien commun. Et cette réflexion résonne profondément avec la mission de notre université, d'autant plus que notre rectrice a fait du vivre ensemble l'axe premier de son mandat. Elle le dit clairement, ce n'est pas une simple formule, mais une volonté centrale dont les implications concrètes doivent permettre à notre communauté de répondre aux défis qui se présentent à elle. Or, les conditions mêmes du vivre ensemble, à savoir l'égalité des chances, la liberté de penser, celle de s'exprimer, la qualité des liens qui unissent une communauté d'individus libres et égaux, ces conditions se trouvent au cœur du geste philosophique de Rousseau, l'enfant de Genève, qui fit de la question de l'inégalité l'un des enjeux fondateurs de la modernité politique. Cette rencontre ce soir entre Rousseau et le professeur Sandel n'a donc rien de formel. Elle dit quelque chose de la vocation d'une université, de notre université, produire des savoirs, former des citoyennes, des citoyens, capables de comprendre un monde complexe et contribuer avec nos partenaires publics, avec nos partenaires associatifs à une société plus juste. Voilà ce qui nous rassemble ce soir, à la croisée de la tradition rousseauiste et des exigences contemporaines du vivre ensemble. Alors, je tiens, moi aussi, à remercier très chaleureusement la Société Jean-Jacques Rousseau, ainsi que l'ensemble des collègues et toutes les équipes qui ont rendu cette rencontre possible. Nous avons ce soir l'occasion rare d'entendre un philosophe qui, loin de se contenter de diagnostiquer les dérives de notre époque, nous invite à imaginer des chemins d'action et de responsabilité. Puissions-nous accueillir cette réflexion avec l'ouverture qui caractérise Genève et avec la volonté d'inscrire ces questions au cœur de notre vivre ensemble. Je vous souhaite une excellente conférence, une très belle soirée, et je passe la parole, je pense, au président.
La parole est à Monsieur le Président du Conseil d'État, Thierry Apotello.
Merci, cher Martin. Monsieur le Consul général, Monsieur le Secrétaire général, professeurs, Mesdames et Messieurs. Nous nous retrouvons ce soir à Genève, un canton qui n'est pas qu'un décor, mais c'est une source. Un canton d'exil, de refuge, de débat, de dissidence, un canton où la question politique ne s'est jamais réduite à la technique du pouvoir, mais plutôt s'est pensée comme une interrogation morale de la vie commune. À Genève, mesdames et messieurs, Jean-Jacques Rousseau n'a pas seulement écrit, non, il a déplacé une ligne de fond. Lorsqu'il s'interroge sur l'origine des inégalités parmi les hommes, il ne décrit pas une fatalité naturelle. Il pose une question politique au sens le plus exigeant. Qu'avons-nous fait de notre liberté lorsque nous acceptons des écarts qui humilient, qui assignent, qui ferme l'horizon. Chez Rousseau, l'inégalité n'est pas un simple fait social, elle est une épreuve pour la légitimité de l'ordre collectif. Cette question formulée par Jean-Jacques Rousseau n'a rien perdu de son actualité. Elle s'est même déplacée au cœur de nos démocraties contemporaines. Les inégalités ne sont plus seulement visibles par les patrimoines ou encore les revenus. Elles s'inscrivent dans les trajectoires de vie, dans l'accès au savoir, à la formation, à l'emploi, à la santé, à la reconnaissance sociale. Elles façonnent des destins avant même que le choix individuel puisse s'exercer. Genève connaît bien ces tensions. Ville prospère, ville internationale, ville des droits, elle est aussi traversée par des contrastes importants. Une concentration de richesses exceptionnelles y cohabite avec des formes de précarité plus discrètes, mais bien réelles, et qui explosent. Le Centre d'analyse territoriale des inégalités de l'Université de Genève le démontre chaque fois. Cette proximité rend l'inégalité encore plus sensible. Elle nous oblige à ne pas l'aborder comme une abstraction statistique, non, mais comme une réalité vécue, quotidienne et surtout silencieuse. Jean-Jacques Rousseau nous avertissait déjà. L'inégalité devient politiquement dangereuse lorsqu'elle s'accompagne d'une forme de perte de réciprocité, lorsque certaines et certains ne se reconnaissent plus dans les règles communes, lorsque la loi cesse d'être perçue comme l'expression d'une volonté partagée, le lien civique alors se fragilise. Et ce n'est pas la diversité des situations qui mine la démocratie, c'est l'idée que le jeu est truqué, que l'effort ne suffit plus et que la dignité dépend ainsi de la place occupée. C'est à cet endroit précis que la réflexion du professeur Sandel prend toute sa force. Son travail ne se contente pas d'arbitrer entre des préférences ou d'optimiser des résultats. Il nous rappelle que la justice ne peut être séparée de la question du bien. Autrement dit, une société juste ne se définit pas uniquement par ce qu'elle contribue, mais par ce qu'elle valorise, par la manière dont elle reconnaît les personnes et leurs contributions. Cette perspective entre résonance directe avec l'héritage de Rousseau est réelle. Celui-ci refusait déjà une vision purement instrumentale du contrat social. Il ne s'agissait pas de maximiser des intérêts privés, mais bien de construire un cadre dans lequel chacun peut se construire et donc en être destinataire de la liberté. La liberté, justement, chez lui, n'est jamais solitaire. Elle est indissociable de l'égalité civique. Or, nos sociétés contemporaines, avouons-le, ont parfois glissé vers une autre promesse, celle d'une justice à l'addition des satisfactions individuelles. Cette approche, souvent qualifiée d'utilitariste, a l'avantage de la simplicité. Elle a aussi un angle mort majeur. Elle peine à saisir ce que peuvent produire les inégalités sur le tissu moral d'une société. Elle mesure des gains, mais ignore les blessures symboliques, le profond sentiment d'abandon ou encore la perte de sens collectif. Genève, par son histoire, par sa situation, est un lieu pertinent pour cette discussion. Genève, cité de la Réforme, a affirmé très tôt que la conscience individuelle et la responsabilité collective ne s'opposent pas. Ville internationale, elle accueille des institutions qui défendent les droits humains, tout en étant confrontée elle-même, sur son propre territoire, aux défis concrets de la cohésion sociale. Cette tension n'est pas un échec, elle est une invitation pour toutes et tous à penser et à agir. Ce soir, certainement qu'il ne s'agira pas d'apporter des réponses toutes faites. Il s'agira de rouvrir des questions fondamentales avec la première d'entre elles. Qu'est-ce qu'une société juste ? Que devons-nous les uns aux autres ? Jusqu'où peut-on accepter des inégalités sans abîmer le socle démocratique ? Ou encore, comment renouer liberté et égalité sans sacrifier l'un et l'autre ? Ces questions ne relèvent ni de la nostalgie ni de l'utopie. Elles sont au cœur de nos choix politiques plus contemporains. Il faut entendre ces questions formulées avec rigueur, exigence et clarté, car c'est une chance. Nous sommes particulièrement honorés d'accueillir ce soir Michael Sandel, dont les travaux ont contribué, bien au-delà du monde académique, à remettre la philosophie morale et politique au centre du débat public. Dans la ville de Rousseau, sa réflexion, évidemment, trouve un écho singulier, celui d'une tradition qui refuse de séparer la justice de la vie réelle, de la liberté, de l'égalité. Je vous souhaite à toutes et à tous une conférence stimulante, exigeante et féconde. Elle nous aidera certainement à penser autrement ce que signifie tenir ensemble aujourd'hui dans des sociétés comme la nôtre, traversées par l'inégalité. Merci beaucoup.
Eh bien, on l'attendait tous, vous l'attendez tous et tous. La parole maintenant est évidemment à Michael Sandel, que je remercie beaucoup et à qui je vous demande de réserver l'accueil le plus chaleureux possible.
Merci. Thank you.
Alors, 2 mots d'organisation. Michael Sandel va prononcer sa conférence, une quarantaine de minutes, à la suite de quoi vous pourrez poser toutes et tous des questions. La conférence de Michael est en anglais, mais vous pouvez poser les questions en français et en anglais. À la suite de ces questions, on projettera un entretien que Michael Sandel a réalisé avec le ministre des Finances grec, ce qui explique aussi la présence du consul, que je salue. Et je signale aussi que le stand Payot à l'extérieur de la salle vous permettra d'acquérir et peut-être de faire signer les ouvrages de Michael. Mais trêve de bavardage, la parole est à vous, Michael.
Thank you. And I want to begin with an apology. My French is very inadequate to deliver a lecture, so forgive me for speaking in English. But during the question center, a session, if you would like to pose questions in French, that's fine. You're welcome to do that. I can understand, but my spoken French isn't good enough, especially for an occasion like this. Thank you, Professor Rueff, and the distinguished hosts, the President of the Conseil d'État, the President of the University of Genève. The three of you have summarized my work so sympathetically and generously and accurately that I have very little work left to do. And you've also, the three of you, rightly described my debt to Rousseau. His discourse on the origins of inequality is my favorite essay in all of political philosophy. I find it deeply inspiring, but also relevant to the current moment. My book, The Tyranny of Merit, as well as some of my earlier books, as Professor Rueff pointed out, are all attempts to explore the relation of politics, civic life, to the question of the good and the common good. And the theme of inequality is present, just as you said, Martin, throughout. And this is a measure of my debt to Rousseau, and especially to this remarkable and inspiring essay. I would like to identify two different accounts of the origin of inequality that Rousseau writes about that can help us understand what we often miss about the sources of anger and resentment that afflict our public life and that now put democracy in peril in many societies. In the second part of the discourse, Rousseau identifies two origins, not one, two origins of inequality. The first origin is the invention of property. The first man who, after enclosing a piece of land, got the idea of saying, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. What crimes, what wars, what murders, what miseries and horrors would someone have spared the human race by pulling up the stakes or filling in the ditch and crying to his fellows, "Stop listening to this impostor. You are lost if you forget that the fruits of the land belong to everyone and the earth belongs to no one." That's what someone should have said back then, Rousseau tells us. And so it seems that the invention of property was the origin of inequality. It was an economic origin, because property is an economic relation. But then Rousseau says, but there was something even prior and more fundamental to that moment in the state of nature. This idea of property depends on many previous ideas that could only have arisen in succession, and thus was not formed in the human mind all at once. And then he describes the second, deeper, more fundamental source of inequality that preceded the invention of property. And he describes the deep past, the deeper state of nature. And he gives us a story. And the story says that gradually we emerge from a kind of animal existence into a certain kind of sociability. People became used to assembling in front of the huts or around a large tree, singing and dancing. True children of love and leisure. This became the amusement, or rather the occupation, of idle and congregated men and women. Each began to look at the others and to want to be looked at. And public esteem came to be valued. The one who sang or danced the best, the handsomest, the strongest, the most skillful, the most eloquent, became the most highly thought of, the most esteemed. And that was the first step toward inequality. That was the first step toward inequality. From these first preferences were born, on the one hand, vanity and scorn, and on the other, shame and envy. And this eventually produced compounds fatal to happiness and innocence. Because as soon as men, this is still Rousseau, as soon as men began to appreciate one another and the idea of respect was formed in their minds, everyone claimed to have a right to it. And failing to respect someone was no longer possible with impunity. Consequently, deliberate wrong became an outrage because, along with the harm resulting from the injury, the offended party often considered the contempt for his person more unbearable than the harm itself. So, this deeper source of inequality, the way we regard one another and care about respect and esteem, that's the true source of inequality, which is to say it's not only or mainly economic. It has to do with mutual regard and recognition. And the contrast between these two accounts, the initial, seemingly economic account, and the deeper account to do the moral account, the account involving esteem and dignity and respect. This contrast is fundamental to making sense of the problem of inequality in our time, and in particular, of the way in which the kind of inequality we have experienced and brought about has contributed to the deep anger and sense of grievance and polarization that afflicts our societies. And so what I write in The Tyranny of Merit, and what I have to say today about the source of democracy's peril, is really a small footnote to Rousseau's discourse on the origins of inequality, because the contrast he draws is central to making sense of our predicament. How so? In recent decades, the divide between winners and losers has been deepening, poisoning our politics, setting us apart. This has partly to do with widening inequalities of income and wealth brought about by the age of neoliberal globalization. But it's not only that. It has also to do, this divide between winners and losers, with the changing attitudes towards success that have accompanied the widening inequalities. Those who've landed on top have come to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty that the market bestows on them, and by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. This way of thinking about success arises from a seemingly attractive ideal, the principle of meritocracy, the principle that says, insofar as chances are equal, the winners deserve their winnings. Now, we know that chances are not truly equal. Children born poor tend to stay poor as adults, even though much of our politics among center-right and center-left parties alike is about trying to establish fair terms of competition, equality of opportunity. Still, social mobility isn't easy. There are some countries where the ability to rise one generation to the next is fairly possible. A study was done asking, with current rates of intergenerational mobility, how many generations would it take for someone born poor to rise not to the top, but to the median income in their society? In Denmark, it takes 2 generations. In the US and in Switzerland, it takes, how many do you think? 5. So it isn't easy to rise. And so it might be thought that the problem with meritocracy is simply that we don't live up to it, that we need to perfect the meritocracy, to make it governed by truly fair equality of opportunity. I'll give you another example of how far we fall short. At US universities, the elite private universities in particular, they offer generous financial aid policies and scholarships to students from low-income and even middle-income families. At Harvard and Stanford, for example, if you come from student comes from a family that makes less than $200,000 a year, you pay no tuition. That's quite generous. If you come from a family that makes less than $100,000 a year, you pay no tuition or room and board. Your costs are covered. And yet, despite these generous financial aid policies, there are more students in these places from families in the top 1% than there are students from the entire bottom half of the country combined. So we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess, but it might be thought that the solution is simply to perfect the meritocracy, to make it more fair. This raises a question. Suppose we could bring about a society with true equality of opportunity, where everyone began the race not only at the same starting line, but also having been provided with the same advantages growing up, the same good coaching and practice facilities and running shoes and health and nutrition. Suppose we could do that, bring everyone to the same starting point. Then we would have a perfect meritocracy, but the question is, would we have a just society? Would we have a good society? It seems to me that the answer to both of those questions is no. The problem is not only that we fail to live up to our meritocratic principles. Meritocracy, the ideal itself, is flawed. It has a dark side. And the dark side is this: meritocracy, even a fully realized one, is corrosive of the common good. And the reason is that, well, it has to do with the attitudes towards success that even a perfectly realized meritocracy would promote. It leads to hubris among the winners and to humiliation for those who lose out. It leads the successful to inhale too deeply of their own success, to forget the luck and good fortune that helped them on their way, to forget their indebtedness to those who make their achievements possible. And it leads them, it invites them to look down on those less fortunate than themselves. This was the worry about meritocracy. Of the person who coined the term, he was a British sociologist named Michael Young. He wrote a book in the late 1950s, The Rise of the Meritocracy, he called it. He was a member of the Labour Party in Britain. He welcomed the fact that in post-war Britain, finally, some young people from working class families were able to get into good schools and compete for good jobs. But he foresaw a problem. As the meritocracy became more and more true in the allocation of opportunities and jobs and social positions, it would sharpen the tendency of hubris among the winners and humiliation among those left behind. Because now everything depended on your effort and talent. In an aristocratic or hereditary society, if you landed on the bottom, you might curse your bad luck, but you couldn't look around and say, I'm a serf or a peasant rather than in the manor house because of my own doing. Likewise, now those who inhabited the aristocracy in the manor houses, they did invent ways of praising themselves. But snobbery, there's aristocratic snobbery, is a different kind of attitude toward being on top. It can't really carry the conviction that I'm here thanks to my own doing. But meritocracy changes that. It's better than the hereditary aristocracy, Michael Young thought, and he was right. It represents an improvement, but it does have this dark side, and he predicted that eventually, as these attitudes towards success, rationalizing the inequalities, took hold, there would be a revolt against the meritocratic elites, overturning them. He predicted that revolt would take place in the year 2034. He was right, but the revolt took place 18 years ahead of schedule in 2016. So what led to the populist backlash against elites? It wasn't simply the widening inequalities of income and wealth. It wasn't only economic. One of the most potent sources of the populist backlash against elites was the sense among many working people that elites look down on them, don't respect the dignity of the work they do. And despite the ugly forms that some of that backlash have taken, it is a legitimate complaint. Because even as globalization brought deepening inequality and stagnant wages, its proponents offered working people some bracing advice. They said, if you're worried about the outsourcing of jobs, and if you're worried about wage stagnation, And the median wage of the average worker in the US, in real terms, was stagnant for 5 decades, even as globalization yielded enormous rewards for the top 10%. But the mainstream politicians of the center-left and center-right offered the following answer to the widening inequalities. If you want to compete and win in the global economy, they said, go to university, get a degree. What you earn will depend on what you learn. You can make it if you try. This advice became reiterated election after election campaign by mainstream parties of the center-left and center-right, to the point of mantra and incantation. And yet, what these elites missed was the insult implicit in their advice. The insult was this: if you didn't go to university, and if you're struggling in the new economy, your failure must be your fault. You didn't do what we told you to do. You didn't improve yourselves. The reason for your predicament is not that we put in place economic policies that led to inequality and wage stagnation for working people. The problem is you did not improve yourselves in the way we recommended so that you could compete effectively. So it's no wonder that many working people turned against the credentialed classes, the professional classes, and the meritocratic elites, which, even as a brief account of how this populist backlash arose, echoes Rousseau's second account of the source of inequality. It isn't only about inequality of income and wealth. It's what really powers the politics of humiliation is about inequalities of social recognition and esteem. And Rousseau saw that in his imagined account of the moment when people began to admire those who could sing the best, or who were the strongest, or who danced the best. And then people began to care who won esteem and social regard. Now, this carries consequences for the place of the common good and deliberation about the common good in politics. Because part of what accompanied the widening inequalities of income and wealth and the parallel inequalities of unequal social recognition and esteem is that two assumptions and practices were operating together. Neoliberalism produced the economic inequalities, but the meritocratic conceptions of success added insult to that economic injury and created the divide between winners and losers. There's a difference between a growing divide between rich and poor, that's economic, and the deepening divide between winners and losers, that's moral and civic. That's about our mutual regard. Now, along with the neoliberal faith, the market faith, and the meritocratic way of conceiving success came a technocratic orientation to public discourse that came readily to those professional classes who had triumphed. And there is, after all, though Michael Young coined the term meritocracy, the idea that those with merit should rule, should govern, that has a much longer history. It goes back to Plato in the Western tradition, to Confucius in the Eastern tradition. But these earlier versions of meritocratic conceptions of governing conceived the merits relevant to governing to consist in more than technocratic competence, technocratic merit. The merits relevant to governing included moral and civic virtue. That's because, in the tradition of Plato and of Confucius, the idea was that the common good consists, at least in part, in the moral education of citizens. Our technocratic version of meritocracy severs the link between merit and moral judgment. In the domain of the economy, it simply assumes that the common good is defined by GDP, an aggregative conception of the common good, maximizing consumer welfare, adding up individual interests and maximizing them. This morally blinkered way of conceiving merit and the common good has weakened democratic societies in several ways. It's failed as a mode of governance. In the last 4 or 5 decades, meritocratic elites have not governed very well. But it has also narrowed the civic project. Because today, the common good is understood mainly in economic terms. It's less about cultivating solidarity or deepening the bonds of citizenship than about satisfying consumer preferences as measured by GDP. This makes for an impoverished public discourse, but beyond that, it's reconfigured the terms of social recognition. It's elevated the prestige of the credentialed professional classes and depreciated the contributions of most workers. And it's this aspect of technocratic merit and conceptions of the common good that contributes most directly to the angry, polarized politics of our time. The loss of jobs to technology and to outsourcing has coincided with a sense that society accords less respect to the kind of work the working class does. As economic activity has shifted from making things to managing money, as society has lavished outsized rewards on CEOs and hedge fund managers. And it's worth pointing out that in the 1970s in the US, the average CEO made 30 times the earnings of the average worker. By 2014, they made 300 times the average worker. But it isn't only a matter of money. As these rewards have been lavished on Wall Street bankers and the professional classes, the esteem accorded work in the traditional sense has become fragile and uncertain. The mainstream parties missed this. They missed this dimension of politics. They thought, in retrospect, they thought the problem with neoliberal globalization was simply a matter of distributive justice. We didn't use the gains from the winners to compensate the loss to the losers. But this was not the only problem. It was a problem that the promised compensation to those who lost out never arrived. But this isn't what fueled the backlash. Because the populist complaint reflects a defect in the technocratic approach to governing, this shrunken notion of the common good. Conducting our public discourse as if it were possible to outsource moral and political judgment to markets or to experts or to technocrats has emptied democratic argument of meaning and purpose. It's created a vacuum at the heart of public discourse. And vacuums of public meaning are dangerous because they are invariably filled by harsh, narrow, authoritarian forms of identity and belonging. When people reach desperately for meaning to fill that void, typically of two kinds: religious fundamentalism or strident hypernationalism, and that's exactly what we've seen in the wake of this governing project. 5 decades of market-driven globalization hollowed out public discourse, disempowered ordinary citizens, and prompted a populist backlash that promises to clothe the naked public square with an intolerant, vengeful nationalism. That's how we arrived at this moment. And this diagnosis, if you find it even partially persuasive, is indebted to Rousseau's distinction, the two sources of inequality. The second being the more fundamental of the two. Now, I want to say a little bit more about the erosion of social esteem for working people, and in particular, the erosion of the dignity of work. The meritocratic age has compounded the economic injury suffered by working people. By valorizing the brains it takes to get into university and to win jobs in hedge funds or in prestigious positions, tells working people that the work they do, less valued by the market than the work of well-paid professionals, is a lesser contribution to the common good. That's the message implicit in the practice. And so, increasingly, those left behind by globalization, those who struggled while others prospered, came to sense that the work they did was no longer a source of social recognition and esteem. In society's eyes, and perhaps also their own, their work no longer signified a valuable contribution to the common good. And this is connected to the way we measure what counts as a valuable contribution to the common good. Part of the teaching, part of the embedded assumption of the market faith, or the neoliberal faith, is that the money people make is the measure of their contribution to the common good. And we easily slide into that assumption. A moment's reflection suggests that that can't possibly be the case, that the verdict of the labor market can't provide a compelling moral account of the value of this or that contribution. Because if that were true, we would have to say that a successful casino mogul, a billionaire casino mogul, must contribute 5,000 times greater value to the economy than your best school teacher, or than a nurse, or for that matter, a physician. Even the most ardent laissez-faire libertarian economists would have a hard time defending that idea on reflection. But we slide into that assumption, and it's worth asking why. Now, there is a reason that goes beyond our love of markets and of consumption. The deep source, I think, of the appeal of this assumption that the money people make must be the measure of their contribution is in pluralist societies, we look around and we notice that we disagree about the good. We disagree about modes of valuation. We disagree about what counts as a valuable contribution. And we know, and we worry, that if we made that the subject of democratic deliberation, that we would have to contend with one another and debate with one another on the contested terrain of the good, the meaning of the good life, the meaning of human flourishing. And so we have a deep reflex to shrink from contested debates in public about the good life and about virtue. And this is why some of the great philosophers of recent times have tried to devise principles of justice. I'm thinking of John Rawls among his followers, that don't presuppose any particular conception of the good life. We live in pluralist societies. We'll never agree on how to value goods. So let's at least seek a framework of rights that's neutral with respect to those contested moral and spiritual questions. And that way of thinking about justice does not, John Rawls was not a defender of neoliberal economics, but that impulse of avoidance that he worked out in a magisterial way in the realm of political philosophy, that strategy avoidance, in ordinary parlance and common thinking, easily slides into the idea that markets are a value-neutral way that will spare us the need for messy, contentious debates about the good and how to value goods and how to value the various contributions people make. So the defects, and Martin, you brought us back generously even to that, to liberalism and the limits of justice. This is what I worried about then. And Rawls was not intending to pave the way to neoliberalism or to a Hayekian account of value or anything of the kind. But it's that impulse to avoid confronting, as democratic citizens, our disagreements and to try to reason in public about competing moral and spiritual conceptions that led center-left, well-intentioned, liberal political parties to a market-friendly stance during the age of globalization. This is how it worked out on the ground. And it included figures, not just Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, the market faith. It included those center-left politicians who succeeded them. Bill Clinton in the United States, Tony Blair in Britain, Gerhard Schroeder in Germany. In the US, for that matter, Barack Obama. They all embraced the neoliberal project of globalization and said, well, they offered the rhetoric of rising. Here's how you can compete and win. That's them. And they also offered the compensation that the winners would transfer to the losers, and that didn't quite work out either. But this is across the political spectrum of the mainstream parties, this impulse. But it's important to recognize how hard it is to offer an alternative public philosophy, because the impulse of avoidance runs very deep. But it's led us, it's paved the way to the authoritarian backlash against this whole arrangement. So, what do we do now? Well, the first thing we have to do is to recognize that the injury that animates the resentment of working people is not mainly economic in the sense of being they feel cut off from access to consumer goods, though they are. It's mainly to do with their status, not as consumers, but as producers. Only a political agenda that acknowledges this injury and seeks to renew the dignity of work can speak effectively to this discontent. This is because, so another way of putting this is, we need an agenda that attends not only to distributive justice, but also to contributive justice. And this is because the anger abroad in the land, in democracies around the world, is at least in part a crisis of recognition. And it's in our role as producers, not consumers, that we contribute to the common good and win recognition for doing so. So we need a shift in political economy from a consumer ethic, a consumer welfare-based politics, to a producer ethic, which is to say, to contributive justice. Now, this contrast, or this shift, points to two different ways of understanding the common good. Rousseau is relevant from this point of view as well. Because the standard reigning approach, familiar among economic policymakers, says the common good is the sum of everyone's individual preferences and interests. And so we achieve the common good when we maximize consumer welfare. But if that's what the common good is, then market wages are as good a measure of any as who has contributed what? A second approach, what I've called contributive justice, rejects the consumerist notion of the common good in favor of what might be called a civic conception. According to the civic conception, the common good isn't simply about adding up preferences or maximizing consumer welfare. It's about reflecting critically on our preferences, ideally elevating and improving them so that we can live worthwhile and flourishing lives. And this can't be achieved through economic activity alone. It requires a certain kind of politics. It requires deliberating with fellow citizens about how to bring about a just and a good society, one that cultivates civic virtue, one that enables us to reason together about the purposes worthy of our political community. The idea that economic policy is ultimately for the sake of consumption runs deep, so much so that it's hard to think our way out of it. Adam Smith declared in The Wealth of Nations, the interest of the producer ought to be attended to only insofar as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. That's Adam Smith. Keynes agreed. The sole end and object of all economic activity, Keynes said, is consumption. Rousseau didn't think so, nor did an older tradition of moral and political economy, going back to Aristotle, who argued that human flourishing depends on realizing our nature through the cultivation and exercise of our abilities. So we need to consider how to shift from a single-minded focus on distributive justice to contributive justice. That in turn requires shifting from a consumerist ethic to a producer ethic, and focusing less on promising to help people scramble up the ladder of success. That's the meritocratic rhetoric arising, even as the rungs on the ladder grow further and further apart, and to focus more on making life better for everyone who contributes to the common good, whether or not they have a university degree. But the price we pay, what makes this hard, this shift in public discourse and in public philosophy, is we have to give up on our impulse to avoidance. We have to grapple directly, our pluralism notwithstanding, we have to grapple directly with public deliberation about human flourishing, the value of social contribution. We have to be willing and able and design structures and a politics that enables us to debate competing conceptions of the good life. There are some who would say that all we really need to do, given the inequalities I've described, is to fulfill the promise of equality of opportunity. It's true, equality of opportunity is a morally necessary corrective to injustice. It's not unimportant. But it's important to remember that equality of opportunity is a remedial principle. It's not an adequate ideal for a good society. No one should be held back by poverty or prejudice. That's the moral force in the idea of equality of opportunity. But it's not an adequate ideal for a good society. Now well, what then? What alternative conception of equality, if not equality of opportunity? Rousseau certainly didn't think equality of opportunity was an adequate conception. Critics often assume that the only alternative to equality of opportunity is a sterile, oppressive equality of results. But there's another alternative that I think is in line with the implications of Rousseau's discourse. What might be called a broad equality of democratic condition. The kind of equality that enables those who don't achieve great wealth or prestigious positions to live lives of decency and dignity, developing and exercising their abilities in work that wins social esteem, sharing in a widely diffused culture of learning, deliberating with their fellow citizens about public affairs. Now, when I say we need to do more than seek a fuller equality of opportunity and a greater social mobility, I'm sometimes confronted with a challenge. Aren't I asking us, especially in my country, but not only in my country, aren't I saying we should really give up on the American dream? Isn't the American dream about social mobility, about individuals rising, about having a fair chance at success? A chance. To try to respond to this challenge, I went back and I looked at the source of the term the American dream. It was a writer, a popular writer, not a philosopher, writing in the 1930s during the Depression. His name was James Truslow Adams. Few recall the book he wrote, but everyone knows the phrase he coined, the American dream. And here's how he defined it. He did think that people should be able to better themselves. That was part of it. But he said, but this American dream is not a dream of motor cars and high wages merely, but a dream of a social order in which each man and each woman shall be able to attain to the fullest stature of which they are capable and be recognized by others for what they are, regardless of the circumstances of birth or position. So it includes mobility, but not only that. It wasn't only about moving up. It was also about achieving a broad democratic equality of condition. And he gave us an example, a concrete example, the U.S. Library of Congress, which drew together, he thought, Americans from all walks of life. As one looks down on the general reading room, he wrote, one sees the seats filled with silent readers, old and young, rich and poor, black and white, the executive and the laborer, the general and the private, the noted scholar and the schoolboy, all reading at their own library, provided by their own democracy. And he said this is what he meant by the American dream. This is what I mean by a broad democratic equality of condition. And he said if this could be carried out throughout American life, the American dream would become an abiding reality. We don't have much equality of condition today in democratic societies, most democratic societies around the world. Public spaces that gather us together across class and race and ethnicity and faith are few and far between. One of the most corrosive effects of the widening economic inequalities of recent decades has been to separate us. Those who are affluent and those of modest means increasingly have come to live separate lives. We live and work and shop and play in different places. We send our children to different schools. And when the meritocratic sorting machine has done its work, those on top find it hard to resist the thought that they deserve their success and that those on the bottom deserve their place too. But, and it's this separation that is ultimately corrosive of a politics of the common good. Democracy does not require perfect equality, but it does require that people from different walks of life, different social classes, encounter one another, bump up against one another in the course of their everyday lives. Because this encounter is how we learn to negotiate and to abide our differences. And this is how we come to care for the common good. The meritocratic conviction that people deserve whatever riches the market bestows on their talents makes solidarity and community an almost impossible project. For why did the successful owe anything to the less advantaged members of society? The answer to this question depends on recognizing that for all our striving, we are not self-made and self-sufficient. Finding ourselves in a society that happens to prize our talents, that's our good fortune, not our due. Recalling the role of luck in life, recalling our indebtedness, this can prompt a certain humility. The humility that enables us to look on those who struggle and say, there but for the accident of fate, or the grace of God, or the mystery of the universe, that could be me. This spirit of humility is the civic virtue we need now. It could be the beginning of a way back from the harsh ethic of success that drives us apart. It could bring us back from the shrunken, narrow, hollowed-out public discourse that invites dark sources of meaning and allegiance. It could point this sensibility, this spirit of humility, as a civic virtue. It could point us, maybe, beyond the tyranny of merit, toward a less rancorous, more generous public life, a broad democratic equality of condition, in the spirit of Rousseau. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, thank you. Thank you. Okay. All right, but there must be some objections, or questions, or challenges. So.
Bien, Michael, vous avez compris aux applaudissements que la conférence n'a pas du tout plu. Donc, on a du temps pour les questions, et donc quelques questions qui peuvent être en français ou en anglais, et Michael répondra en anglais.
Hello, my name is Jasmine Verdi. I just wanted to thank you for your talk. It was really excellent. So I wonder if your views on meritocracy ultimately imply a universal basic income, or at the very least, universal basic services for all citizens, which include housing, rent, healthcare, things like that. Because if you take seriously the position that markets shouldn't be the judge of what is socially valued, then you can argue that non-market work, such as being a carer for someone in your family that's ill, should be valued by society in a concrete way, i.e. it should be paid. But you can go even further than that and say that you could argue that sitting on a sofa for instance, and just introspecting, just reflecting on your actions, that could also be of value to society, because that, at least in my case, has helped to frame my ethics. So that introspection should also be valued to society, because society ultimately benefits from ethically motivated citizens. So, yeah, I was just wondering if your philosophy ultimately brings one to a UBI or a universal basic services.
Sorry. Yes. Yes and no. I'll come to the universal basic income in a moment. A publicly provided safety net that assures access for everyone to essential human goods, including healthcare, education, security, old age security, and housing. That's morally important for its own sake. But from a civic point of view, we need also an emphasis not only on a safety net to provide essential needs for those who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford them, but we need what might be described as a civic infrastructure for a shared common life, by which I mean public facilities, public places, and common spaces that gather us together, from public parks and recreation areas to public libraries and cultural centers, municipal swimming pools, public schools, not only for reasons of distributive justice and fairness to those who can't afford to go to a private health club. That's not the only reason to have playgrounds and parks and swimming pools that are public. It's to bring people into the kind of encounter that reminds us that we are all in this together. So that's why I don't think a safety net alone, important though it is adequate to the broad democratic equality of condition, the civic project, the mutual recognition that are missing from contemporary life in varying degrees. Some societies, some cities and towns do a better job of this than others. As for a universal basic income, it could be seen as a cash version of the kind of safety net that I was referring to. And when you mention the advantages of a universal basic income, including allowing you to hang out on your couch and reflect, I did notice that you qualified that by assuring us that your reflections actually would have some consequences in your role as a citizen. You added that toward the end. And I was waiting for that. Because my first answer was going to be would depend on what you were actually doing and thinking while you were communing with yourself and introspecting on your couch. Beyond that, I think you're trying to put some pressure on my emphasis on the dignity of work by your scenario of the couch surfer with the universal basic income. And I do want to resist somewhat that idea. Politically, many of the proponents of the universal basic income today are Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, who essentially anticipate a world in which their robots, will make much of work obsolete. And they want to forestall political resistance, and so they say, don't worry, the gains to the winners can be used to offset those for whom work becomes obsolete. We've heard that promise before. That was the whole promise that was made by the mainstream economists who told us that the age of neoliberal globalization would help everybody. We've heard it before, and in this case, that promise can be used and is being used to try to fend off critical scrutiny of the direction of technological innovation. The default direction set, if it's only set by venture capitalists in Silicon Valley, the default direction of technological innovation in AI will be automation of jobs. And too readily accepting that payoff, that buyout, could easily forestall or deflect public scrutiny and public debate about what the direction of technological innovation should be for the sake of the common good, not just for the sake of promoting the profits of these companies. That's why I am ambivalent about a universal basic income.
Thank you so much, Michael, for this talk. I'd like to bring another Genevan name here, Jean Calvin. Because obviously, you know, Calvin's role in all this is to turn fate into God's will and God's will into merit. And this has been inscribed deeply at the heart of American capitalism.
Yes.
Just have to read Carnegie's text, etc.
Right.
And so it's, and therefore at the heart of global capitalism, because global capitalism is, you know, has emerged from American capitalism. So this is really, it's a notion of moral merit that is very deeply ingrained in the system. And so if we want to go the path you're telling us we have to go, with which obviously I very much agree, we have to undo this very tightly knit moral merit inscription at the heart of the system in which we're set.
Right.
So it's very difficult.
Yeah, okay, it's a wonderful question, and I know you've thought a lot, you've thought deeply about this. We do have to undo the grip of merit that operates at the basis. It operates as a kind of political theology of the economy, or of the neoliberal economy. Calvin can be seen either as a villain or as a resource in this rethinking for the following reason. It's interesting, debates about merit predated Michael Young and the use of meritocracy in contemporary economic and social debate, as you well know. The first and most consequential and far-reaching debate about merit was not about money, but about salvation. It was a theological debate within Christianity, and the theology begins as resolutely anti-meritocratic, going back to Augustine. Augustine rejected the idea that salvation is a reward for superior merit, even merit as measured by faith and devotion and good works. He rejected that. He saw that as blasphemy and hubris because it would constrain God's omnipotence God can save whomever he wants. And if we can earn and therefore compel God's decision on who will be saved, that undermines God's omnipotence. This was Augustine's argument. He was anti-meritocratic. Salvation is a matter of grace, not merit. Then that idea, it becomes eroded over some centuries because it's hard to abide. I think that's one of the reasons it becomes eroded. And as practice, as the theology in practice encourages people to live faithful lives and to go to Mass and to observe the sacraments, doing all of these things that are required tempts one to think that it'll help one be saved. But Luther thought this tendency to think of good works and faithful devotion as a matter of self-help. He held to this Augustinian anti-meritocratic view because it violates the idea of salvation as grace. And then, all right, what about Calvin? Calvin accepts Luther's theology of grace. He does not claim that salvation is a matter of self-help and of merit. So how does that, in fact, he argues that salvation is predestined. And if salvation is predestined, by definition, it can't depend on rewarding merit. It can't be earned by the lives we live or the devotion we display, which raises an interesting question, which is really the question you're putting to all of us. How then did that turn into the Protestant work ethic, which brought meritocracy right to the heart of American capitalism, the work ethic, self-help? God helps those who help themselves. Well, with the Puritans, they came to America, they were Calvinists. So they had this official theology of grace and predestination. But, and couple that, there's one other twist, that the Puritans taught that work in a calling is a sign of salvation. And that gives rise to the work ethic, to a fervent work ethic, because of course, you don't know whether you've been predestined for salvation, but you do know that good work, a strong work ethic, and amassing the material rewards that go with the work ethic, that's where capitalism comes in, are a sign of salvation. So psychologically, wouldn't you go for that? I mean, it is a motivator to work hard and to display a work ethic in a calling, not to amass great wealth, but to demonstrate to oneself, maybe and to others, that you are among the elect. But that's one small step away from undermining the theology of grace. Because once we're convinced that the work ethic, work in a calling, and success in amassing earthly material rewards as a result of that work is a sign of salvation, it's very hard not to take the next step, which is to see it not as a sign, but as a source of salvation. And with the Protestant work ethic in America made that slide and came to see hard work and the accumulation of material things as a source, not merely a sign of salvation. Now, theologically, could it have been otherwise? Would it be possible to hold that line? It's hard to know. But morally, spiritually, psychologically, it's very hard, once you've got this work ethic, not to make that slide from seeing it as a sign to seeing it as a source. And then, once that happens, Protestant work ethic fuels a galloping capitalism, and the idea that it's not for the sake of the accumulation. That also falls by the wayside. And this is Max Weber's account of how, as you well know, the Protestant ethic fuels capitalism. But, so that's why I say, sorry for a long answer, that's why Calvin is such an interesting figure, because his theology is still with grace, not merit. He's an anti-meritocrat. But once the branch of Calvinists got to America, they followed this other path. And so now in looking for moral and spiritual sources to rein in merit, if we're looking for religious and spiritual sources, one can look either to these early Protestant theologians, Luther and Calvin, but we have to reconstruct the legacy of Calvin, or for that matter, Catholic social teaching, which is another source, spiritual source, of anti-meritocratic moral and spiritual thinking. And we see this also in politics to some extent, if we look at the challenges to the meritocratic faith, if we're looking for the religious sources. Thank you. I'm sorry I went on at such length, but it's a fascinating moment when this happens, and you brought that before us, so thank you. And we're in Geneva. We're in Geneva, so it's unavoidable. No, but right. So somehow from Geneva to Boston, something was lost in translation.
Professor Sandel, thank you very much for your extremely stimulating lecture. During the 4 or 5 decades you mentioned of the ascent of neoliberalism, I can't help thinking that there's a negative correlation of 2 institutions which have declined in importance in communities, in countries. The first one is spiritual and religious life. And the second one, for me personally even more important, is universal conscription.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that should be the solution that everybody has to go to the army, but what do you think of I don't want to call it a recipe, but what about not universal conscription, but universal civil service for everyone 1 to 2 years?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. I'm sympathetic to it, is the short answer. And here I was talking about public places, class mixing institutions. Universal national service traditionally has been a potent class mixing experience and one that cultivates certain civic virtues and orientation to the common good, and it breaks down the class barriers, or could. So yes, I think that should be part of any agenda that tries to take civic virtue and commonality and class mixing seriously. Yeah.
Bien, merci beaucoup. On va devoir s'arrêter pour les questions, pour pouvoir projeter l'entretien que Michael a eu avec le ministre grec des Finances. Vous allez voir que les questions qui ont été abordées pendant la conférence se retrouvent dans le film, sur un autre plan. Donc je dirais peut-être que celles et ceux qui doivent partir, parce qu'il est tard, peut-être pendant qu'on met en route le film, profiter de ce moment-là. Voilà. Merci en tout cas pour vos questions.
Okay, so I should go down.
Minister, Professor, it is really, truly a great honor for me to moderate this dialogue between the Greek Minister of Finance and President of the Eurogroup, Mr. Kyriákos Pierrakákis, and philosopher Michael Sandel, professor at Harvard University. This meeting has been organized by the Jean-Jacques Rousseau Society, of which I am president, and the University of Genève, where I teach with my colleague Fabrice Brandly, I want to thank, in collaboration with the Greek weekly Tovima, whom I would like to thank too for their intellectual and logistical support in the person of Angelos Alexopoulos. Our goal here, our aim, is not to replay the old sin of the philosopher, Michael Sandel, and the politician, the minister. A scene marked by disagreement, the former, the philosopher, giving lessons in depth to the later, the politician, and the later, the politician, giving lessons in realism to the former, the philosopher. No, it's not like that today. Rather, it is about sharing theoretical and practical experiences around a question whose urgency was first articulated by Rousseau in his second discours. The question of the origins and foundations of inequality among men. Actually, for Rousseau, and I would say for Sandel too, inequality is not just one political problem among many. It is the essential political problem, meaning that it is the problem that politics is called upon to solve. If humans transformed their early communities into political society, it was to establish systems of legislations that would allow them to be all equally free. Because inequality hinders freedom, which is something that those who are victims of inequality suffer from constantly. Inequality is a very common feeling. It provokes indignation, sometimes shame, often anger. And when politics fails to address inequality or addresses inequality poorly, citizens lose hope in it and turn to extreme forms of violence. It is because Pierrakákis and Sandel do not consider equality to be une simple chimère, a mere dream, that we have brought them together today to discuss about that. Pierrakákis is currently Greece's Minister of Finance, having previously served as a Minister of Education and of Digital Reforms. He now heads the Eurogroup. Michael Sandel is one of the most influential political philosophers of our times. He teaches political and moral philosophy at Harvard and is the author of powerful, profound, and thought-provoking works. I could quote Liberalism and the Limits of Justice. I could quote The Case Against Perfections, Ethics in the Age of Genetic Engineering, but also a beautiful book, What Money Can't Buy, The Moral Limits of Markets, The Tyranny of Merits, What Equality Means, a conversation with Thomas Piketty, and Michael Sandel just won the Berggren Prize, which is the Nobel for the philosopher. First of all, about the dignity, the dimension of dignity. When does inequality, Michael, stop being an economic issue and become a civic injury? Is it possible to think about inequality without thinking about the common good?
Thank you, Professor Ruth, and thank you, Minister Pierrakákis, for this conversation. I'm honored to be a part of it. To answer your question, Martin, when inequality becomes more than an economic matter, but a kind of civic injury, let me tell you an anecdote. A couple of years ago, my family and I were on vacation in Florida. We were staying in a condominium, and I got into the elevator, and there was a woman in the elevator. She said to me, "Where are you from?" I said, "Boston." Her reply, she said, "I am from Iowa, and do you know, in Iowa, we can read." I found this a very puzzling reply. I had not said, "I'm a Harvard professor." I was not wearing a Harvard sweatshirt. I was not even wearing a Boston Red Sox baseball cap. All I said was I was from Boston. And then when the elevator came to her floor and she walked out, she said to me, "You know, we don't very much like people from the coasts." Now, it seems to me, now she was probably middle class, upper middle class woman. So this is not about a sense of economic grievance or economic injury or inequality, but telling me with a sense of resentment, you know, we can read in Iowa, suggests the kind of civic injury, Martin, that you are referring to. And I think that this exchange, this puzzling exchange at the time, is a kind of window into the sense of grievance and resentment that goes right to questions of dignity and recognition that underlies the polarization that afflicts many of our societies, and that has opened the way to a kind of authoritarian populist backlash against elites that is casting a shadow over the future of democracy. So if I could put, do you think that the mainstream political parties of the center left and the center right over the past 4 or 5 decades have contributed to, or put it this way, failed to address the deepening economic inequalities and have contributed to turning those inequalities, those economic inequalities, into inequalities of respect, dignity, social recognition, and esteem? What do you think?
I think that this is a very pertinent question. First, with regards to how we structure the equation of inequality within the economic system per se or within a broader social system. I would say that any economic equation is structured in a social context, and only to view economics in terms of sheer data without social interpretations, I think it's de facto mistaken. Of course, there are certain, I would say, objective variables that one can see at, being able to have a certain level of subsistence, being able to sustain a household. But apart from that, you also have equalities of opportunity and inequalities in terms of opportunity, and you have parameters of mobility, which are extremely important in order to be able to uphold the social contract. And since you mentioned the traditional political parties, from my understanding, the sheer interpretation of what constitutes left, center, and right starts from the French Revolution, how the representatives sat at that time. So those who wanted to uphold the existing order or those who wanted to completely change it. And the definitions have evolved a lot in the process because the economy has changed a lot in the process. Social systems have changed a lot in the process, and technology has changed a lot in the process. That being, in Schumpeterian terms, I would say the locomotive of change in economic growth. Our world is exponential, and political parties haven't managed to respond, I would say, throughout the world, not only in Europe, in those exponential challenges. So we understand the world linearly, even though the world is increasingly exponential, and the political systems, unfortunately, react in a sublinear fashion. So in this regard, I think it's still quite difficult to address the challenges of today because our political vocabulary has, to a very large extent, you framed it as in the last 3-4 decades. I would say that still many political parties employ the political vocabulary of the 70s and the 80s, but we live in a different era and a different world. And in order to address the emerging inequalities and the emerging growth challenges, we need to adapt our vocabulary to that as well. Final point, I would say to this question, I was very much influenced as a student by the work of Robert Putnam and social capital and how we manage to structure social relationships, be that a function of both social systems and the economic equation itself. And what we're seeing with regards to what you suggested in your question, this sense of non-ownership to society for certain groups, is also a function of that. We're seeing eroding levels of trust in the social fabric in many parts of the world, and we need to further understand how to catalyze this. And this is not only a discussion for a Minister of Finance, it's a broader discussion about governmental instruments in education, in social security, in health systems, to be able to offer new tools to address emerging inequalities that are emerging in a faster pace compared to what was happening in the past.
Is meritocracy a promise we can keep? Or is it a story we should rewrite? And I say that also because I have been a student in France where meritocracy was a kind of dream from Rousseau, okay? And then I think, Minister, it's a question also for you, the relationship between education and meritocracy. But first, Michael, if you're okay.
The meritocracy has been seen as a dream, as an ideal, not only in France and in Europe, certainly in the United States. But it's worth thinking about the status of that dream and that promise. If the alternative to meritocracy is aristocracy, or feudal privilege, or allocating social roles and opportunities based on the accident of birth. If the alternative is nepotism, cronyism, and corruption in distributing government jobs, and for that matter, access to income and wealth, meritocracy seems a breath of fresh air. In fact, it seems even the definition of a just society itself. And underlying that ideal is the idea that if everyone had a truly fair start in life, if everyone had all of the basic goods that the minister was referring to a moment ago, equal access to a good education, to health care, to income security, and the like, if everyone had fair equality of opportunity, would that make for a just society? Would a perfect meritocracy make for a good society? And in the tyranny of merit, I suggest that it wouldn't. Now, part of the problem is we don't live up to the meritocratic principles we profess. Children born poor tend to stay poor as adults.
It isn't easy to rise, even in societies that put in place strong safety nets. But the question that intrigues me and that I try to address in The Tyranny of Merit is, suppose we could achieve a perfect meritocracy with genuinely fair equality of opportunity. Would that be a good society? And I argue that it would not be, because
that was your argument.
Right, because meritocracy has a dark side. And the dark side is that even a perfect meritocracy would be corrosive of the common good. It would encourage, and it does encourage, the successful to believe that their success is their own doing, the measure of their merit, and that they therefore deserve the full bounty the market bestows on them, and by implication, that those who struggle must deserve their fate too. And this harsh way of thinking about success is what leads to the divide that we've seen between winners and losers, and to the anger and resentments that we've been discussing.
I adhere to what is suggested by Professor Sandel. Everything depends on the definitions. Certain things use the same term to say different things, and everything is context relevant. It depends on the society that you're trying to address. So if you're speaking about meritocracy in terms of a society that does not have proper institutions and you want the institutions to function, then it's a good thing. But if you speak about it in terms of a destiny that is very much affected by your social status ex ante before you start, then it's a bad thing. And I fully adhere to this, because my motto when I was education minister was excellence, or our level of meritocracy. It's not about social status. It's about becoming the best version of yourself, whatever that might be, and thus providing you the tools and the instruments to be able to achieve this. Now, is this fully feasible in our social systems? No. But this is what we should be aspired to create in the new social structures of the 21st century, also in light of the technological developments. And I mentioned technology. I would say that the core question, the core challenge for every education minister in the world right now, in a world much changed by AI and fourth industrial revolution technologies, is you design an education system, let's say, for 4 years. And you need to somehow envision and imagine the world where they will graduate being 18 to start. How will that world look? Demographics are changing, life expectancy is increasing in many parts of the world, and technology is exponential. What are the professions of tomorrow, and what types of skills do you endow those children with to be able to address the challenges from that standpoint, to be able to have, let's say, a very good shot at achieving their dreams? This is a function of the economy and the social systems. In a changing landscape, what are the new political cleavages emerging in technology? What are the new political cleavages in regulation? What does it mean to endow every kid with specific opportunities and to have a level playing field for them? And I think we have lots of work ahead of us and not a lot of time.
I worry about two problems in relation to education and meritocracy. One problem has to do with fairness and inequality, the growing divide between winners and losers that we've been discussing. The tendency today of meritocratic educational institutions to freeze in place inherited cultural advantages, those born into favorable circumstances. That's one problem. Call that the problem of fairness. But there's a second problem I worry about, which is the corrosive effect that meritocratic competition and striving has on the way we teach students and on the way students regard their own education and the purpose of education. I look at my students who are the winners in the meritocratic tournament, and they are keenly aware of this, and yet even after winning admission to a competitive university, they feel driven, they feel pressured in the same way they've been pressured for years growing up to compete, to strive, and to view every achievement as a step, as a tool, as an instrument to the next one. And what this does, this is corrosive of the value, the intrinsic good of education, which is to cultivate the love of teaching and learning, of reading, of deliberating, of reflecting critically on one's own moral and civic convictions, to figure out, especially in the undergraduate years, what's worth caring about and why, what career paths are worthy of one's moral and human aspirations. I worry that the incessant networking, the seeking after credentials, the competition that we have cultivated, this is the culture that surrounds meritocratic striving, is distracting us as educational institutions from our mission and purpose. And so that's a worry, I think, that is comparable in importance to the worry we've been discussing about fairness and inequality of access.
For me, digital means empowerment. And this is what we should focus on as ministers of states. I was in a very bureaucratic accounting to be able to create a platform, gov.gr, where we would offer thousands of services to citizens to visit from home or from their work rather than having to physically visit their public services. And we wanted to do that by simplified access public services. And this was something which was immensely popular in society. It's perceived as one of the most popular reforms we ever did. And it's also, I would say, commentary vis-a-vis what the state does. So the question was how redesign the offer towards the citizens in order to give them power. And then you imagine how important this is for people with disabilities, for people with working people with families that cannot leave families to go and visit a public service, especially very bureaucratic world. But you have the world of Kafka, you also have the world of Orwell. So what I just described was addressing the challenges of the world of Kafka. But we also need to address the latter, and this is where regulation plays a huge role. And we often speak about the EU being a regulatory superpower in negative terms, or we believe that we overregulate certain things. And we should simplify. I've been one of the very strong advocates of simplifying regulations that we have. But on the other, I would say, end, proper and smart regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe is a projection of our values vis-a-vis what technology should be doing and how it should be protecting citizens in its deployment. And I really remember from my days at school that we had the dilemma in regulation, all the Collinger's dilemma, regulate too early and problematically affecting the deployment of the technology, regulate too late, ex post, and you don't manage to achieve much. So the question here is how you can be a producer and a regulator at the same time. And I think this is a broader challenge for yet and for technological goods as well. But we need to reverse engineer the social need. Final point on this, technology policy is effectively not about, at the end of the day, not about the technology itself, not about technological solutions. Technology policy is about citizens and people's needs. How do you optimally address them, and how do you provide them tools, how do you endow them to be able to solve problems of their daily lives? If understood as such, if designed as such, it can be a very positive force for global change and for social mobility.
So we have the time for one last question. What is for you the moral duty of political leadership today? Is it honesty? Is it imagination? Is it the urge for protection? What is it for you who could define a good leadership against inequality?
I would say it's impossible, Shapur, but you need balance, which is missing from many parts of the world between all of those significant parameters that you mentioned, dimensions that you mentioned. And you need to have this balance with humility, with knowing what you don't know, but knowing that you need to start asking the right questions. And I would underline one thing, which erodes trust in many societies, the lack of efficiency. Because what they say we must do And what we do, we need to do well and to do effectively. And when we fail to do so, we need to be able to acknowledge it and move fast by changing and adapting. And on many parts of the world, the delivery of policy hasn't been that efficient. And together with the way political competition, let's say, compares throughout the world right now, I think that this has eroded trust towards politicians to deliver change in public policy at speed and at scale. So we need to become more curious. We need to enter this age of curiosity, and we need to do that with nimbleness and speed in the solutions that we will pass.
I agree with the minister that efficiency, government efficiency in delivering needed public services and in adopting policies that work can contribute to rebuilding trust. But I would add another element of what's necessary to begin to build trust. And I'm not suggesting the minister would disagree, but my emphasis would be beyond efficiency on building and cultivating community, reweaving the moral fabric that holds societies together. One of the most corrosive aspects of the economic inequality of recent decades has been that those is that it has separated us from one another. Those who are affluent and those of modest means increasingly live separate lives. We send our kids to different schools. We live and work and shop in different places. We don't encounter one another from different walks of life, across different social and ethnic and backgrounds in the course of the day. And so what I think we need to do to bring about a greater sense of community is to build a kind of broad democratic equality of condition that goes beyond mobility, that goes beyond fairness, that creates public spaces and common spaces.
Michael, it's a beautiful conclusion, and I was thinking, I was hearing Rousseau. I was listening to Rousseau. Build a broad sense of community. That's the meaning of contrat social.
I would say that those spaces that Professor Sandel spoke about, and me coming from a digital background to a certain extent, I would say that they cannot only lead it. That we need physical interaction, but we need to be in touch with each other physically.
I very much
and digital can augment if properly designed, but it cannot be the nucleus of what proposition that suggested.
I agree.
I think that this dialogue was an example what discussion between a very important political figure like you, Minister, and a great philosopher like Michael Sandel can be. Respect, attention, humility from both of you. If the world was ruled with these principles, I think it could go better.
Thank you. Thank you all. And thank you, Martin. Thank you very much.